Before we talk about executory interest, let's just do a quick review of remainders, of contingent remainders. So here we have a grant to A for life, then to B if she graduates law school, otherwise to C. So what does this create? This creates a life estate in A. Then B has a contingent remainder. B is an identified person, but there's a contingency that has to be satisfied before B gets the property. And there's an alternative contingent remainder, because if B doesn't satisfy the condition, then C will get the property. So the contingency is B graduating from law school. Either B will do it, in which case B gets the property, or B will die without having done it, in which case the property will go to C. If, on the other hand, the grant is to A for life, then to B if she graduates law school, without another contingency, it's still a contingent remainder in B, but there's an implied reversion to O should B die without graduating from law school. With that in mind, let's look at a different grant. To A for life, then to B, but if B sells alcohol on the premises, then to C. So again, what do we have here? To A for life, right, that's obviously a life estate. Now, what matters here is the exact language, because the difference between a contingent remainder and a vested remainder subject to divestment and an executory interest can be very slight. Here, we have a grant to A for life, and then the next grant is then to B. This is a remainder in fee simple, but it is subject to divestment. But if B sells alcohol on the premises, then to C, that is an executory interest. It is an interest that deprives B of the remainder in fee simple. Executory interest. An executory interest is a future interest in a transferee. Notice, that matters a lot. O can never have an executory interest. O might have a possibility of reverter or a right of reentry, but an executory interest is only an interest created in a third party. It is an interest that, in order to become possessory, has to divest or cut short some interest in another transferee or divest the transferor in the future. What that simply means is that an executory interest cuts short the preceding interest, regardless of whether the preceding interest is held by the original grantor or the grantor has transferred the interest to somebody else but created an executory interest that could short circuit that transfer. So here's an example. O leaves Whiteacre to A and his heirs, but if A dies without issue surviving him, then to B and her heirs. Has a vested remainder to A and his heirs. And then there's a comma and a but. That's a big signal that what's coming next is an executory interest. But if A dies without issue surviving him, then to B and her heirs. So B has an executory interest. You could write this same grant as alternative contingent remainders, but you would write it differently. So here is an explanation of the difference between a contingent remainder and an executory interest. To A for life, then to B if she survives A, otherwise to C. Here, both grants have a contingency. So these are alternative contingent remainders. At A's death, right, when the life estate to A ends, the contingency will be resolved one way or the other. B will either survive A, in which case B will take the property, or B will have died earlier, in which case C will take the property. The contingency is B outliving A, and it applies to both B's grant and C's grant. That means it's alternative contingent remainders. By contrast, if the grant is to A for life, then to B, but if B does not outlive A, then to C, the grant to B has no contingency. So this is a vested remainder subject to executory limitation. And the grant to C, which is but if B does not outlive A, then to C, that's an executory interest. Another example. To A for life, then to B if he marries X, otherwise to C. A, again, has a life estate, right? And what we have here are alternative contingent remainders. B's remainder is contingent on B marrying X. C's contingent remainder is contingent on C not marrying X. Both of those grants are contingent. By contrast, if the grant is to A for life, then to B, but if B doesn't marry X, then to C, that creates a vested remainder in B that is subject to divestment, and C has an executory interest that blows up B's vested remainder. So let's look at some problems and make sure that we understand this. So via valid will, O leaves Blackacre to A for life, remainder to those of A's children who graduate from law school. If A is alive and has no children, or have children who have not graduated from law school, the children, maybe the not yet existing children, have a contingent remainder, and the way this is written, O has an implied reversion. As A's children graduate from law school, they acquire a vested remainder subject to open, and the non-lawyer children, siblings, still have a contingent remainder. Without children, the property will revert to O. Let's assume that O leaves Blackacre to A for life, then to those of A's children who graduate from law school, and if none of A's children graduate from law school, then to B. If A is alive and has no children, or has children who have not yet graduated from law school, those children have a contingent remainder, and B also has a contingent remainder. As A's children graduate from law school, their remainder vests subject to open. B's contingent remainder is destroyed, and the non-lawyer siblings still have a contingent remainder. If A never has children, or has children who die without having graduated from law school, B's contingent remainder will vest. This is how to do it, writing a will with alternative contingent remainders. What if instead somebody wanted to create an executory interest? How would they do that? So let's look at another example. What if instead O leaves Blackacre to A for life, then to B, but if any of A's children graduate from law school, Blackacre shall go to those children. Now, A still has a life estate, but B has a vested remainder subject to divestment, and A's children have an executory interest. The reason I'm sort of making you think carefully about what exactly is created is that it matters for the rule against perpetuities. So if A has no children, then there's nobody to have the executory interest, right? And if A dies without children, B just keeps the property. If A dies with no lawyer children, again, B keeps the property here. If any of A's children graduate from law school, that executory interest will deprive B of the property, and the children will take the property. What those children have, however, can be partially divested from them if their siblings go to law school. So if only one of A's children goes to law school, that child will take all of the property. If another child then graduates from law school, now the first child's share is divided in half because they each get an equal share of the property, and so on and so forth. So let's look at a different grant. To my son A for life, then to A's children and their heirs. If at the time of O's death, A has no children, this grant creates a contingent remainder following the life estate, and O has an implied reversion. Once children are born, their interest vests subject to open. Each child has a share of the remainder. So if 2 years later, A has two children, B and C, they have a vested remainder subject to open. Now this is a present property right that can be left via will, even though there's no present right to possess the property while A is alive. So if B dies, leaving a husband H and a child E, and B's will leaves everything in her possession to H, and then A dies, C still owns the vested remainder that C had upon birth, and B's vested remainder has passed via will to H. So that C and H will each own 50% of Black Egg. B's child doesn't inherit anything because, unlike the problem we did the other day in class, this does not pass via O's intestate succession. Here, B has, at the time of death, a vested remainder subject to open. That is an estate that can be passed via will to H. Therefore, H inherits the vested estate subject to open, and when A dies, right, the class of people who could be A's children also closes, and H has the half share inherited from B.